Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Welcome on my behalf, of course, and on behalf of the entire team of BAC. We gathering in the context of propositions number 9, deserting from the culture wars, which we actually began this afternoon with the first training by Jonas Staal. We will hear something about that training later on. But for those of you who do not yet know, I just want to say that this is a week-long series of trainings, lectures, panel discussions that seeks to bring together artists, scholars, activists in various formats to reflect upon this current moment of ever more polarizing ideological combat of culture wars. This proposition number 9 is co-convened with Sven Lütticken. Sven is an art historian, critic, and editor, and a senior research advisor of BAC. Sven will take the floor in a minute for his keynote and an in-depth introduction to deserting from the culture wars. But before that, thank you, Sven, for such an extraordinary and profoundly inspiring collaboration, or should I say collaborations, and I look forward to more. But first, in a few minutes, really just few minutes that I have, I would like to make 5 very brief introductory notes. As has become clear in the meantime, this session takes place in the framework of the long-term BAC research itinerary titled Propositions for Non-Fascist Living. Many of you familiar faces are familiar with this research itinerary that we run since 2017. Of course, this series is prompted or driven, if you will, by the urgency that is researching of fascisms into the present. Now, fascisms in their historical guise, as well as fascism's contemporary iterations. Fascisms, if you will, in their expanded sense, historically, geographically, and substantively, as a cluttered composite of multiple large-scale state corporate, dictatorial, militaristic, and destructive conducts, as much as of the micro-authoritarian impulses colonizing the everyday through patriarchy, misogyny, bigotry, xenophobia, racism, and many other culture codes at odds with the values of social and ecological justice. And yet these historical contemporary variations of fascism are decidedly not the subject matter. They are decidedly not the theme of this series. Or in other words, fascism is not what this project is about. It is not about the cartography's definitions, representations, or simply critiques of fascism. Instead, the project is an uncompromising rejection of fascism. Stronger yet, this very rejection of fascism is a driving force behind its coming to life, conjoined with an intense yearning for being together otherwise. Now, the ethical and political foundations of the project Propositions for Non-Fascist Living lie in this tension between the oppositional and the generative, between urgency to resist the fascist predicament of the present on one hand, and on the other to think, imagine, and actualize the alternatives. The project thus engages the creative force of the imagination in art and daily activist practices with the robust task of envisioning and materializing the world otherwise. So the questions that project asks, among many other, include how such critique as proposition can help us to repurpose one's dialectical positioning into grounds from which to imagine, create, and inhabit alternatives, and how to create propositions. This is about propositions, not merely as conceptual fictions, but also as projects of fact, both against and in spite of the fascist predicament of the present. This brings me to the second note. In this chapter that we're opening today, we're looking at this fascist predicament of the present through the prism of the ideological combat that is culture wars. Prompted by the question how, in this context, could one envision and practice the art of living counter to all forms of fascism, and this term, this expression, art of all forms of fascism, some of you have recognized as the citation from Michel Foucault, from whom we at BAC borrowed the term non-fascist life. Now, within the search of the means to generate knowledge about, develop proposals for, and activate tactics of this art of living counter to all forms of fascism, Sven has suggested the notion of active desertion. An active desertion from culture wars, an active refusal to play war games, to be distracted from the course, to imagine and actualize on our own terms the world otherwise. Desertions, Sven offers, should be understood not as withdrawal into a realm of apolitical privacy, but as pursuit of different strategies, tactics, collaborations, coalitions, and temporalities. Would my artists and others who are engaged with images and imaginaries, with narratives and assemblies, have to contribute to the collective discovery of different modes of living culture, unquote. 3. If the series Propositions for Non-Fascist Living indeed is the framework within which we gather here today and in the course of the next couple of days, this assembly is also taking place as part of the project Trainings for the Not Yet. Itself, it's an exhibition as a series of trainings for a future of being together. Otherwise, to quote Jeanne van Heijswijk, indeed convene together with the multiple of collaborators by artist Jeanne van Heijswijk. It is Jeanne and the assembly of remarkable, multi-talented people, ideas, and learning objects all around us that she has brought together, from whom we are learning multitudes of strategies. Most importantly, how to train one another and how to learn collectively something that does not yet exist. Thank you, Jeanne, dearly, for this opportunity, as much as for letting this assembly inhabit not only this training ground and this exhibition, but this particular work of art that I'm inhabiting at this very moment, which is a 2014 work titled, fittingly, Mobile of Interdependency, Acts of Balance. It's realized by Jeanne van Heijswijk and Afrikaanderwijk Cooperative, and it's a work that reflects values of an experimental solidarity economy and the collective forms of governance of the cooperative, a radical form of local self-organization, if you will, and certainly self-empowerment. It is a stark reminder of interdependence within collectivity that shares the concerns and ambitions to fulfilling multiple social, ecological, and culture aspirations, indeed in the world, if you will, otherwise. 4. When standing amidst this work, I cannot but think about another collective political experiment, namely the political practice of stateless democracy by the Kurdish communities and their Assyrian and Arab allies in northern Syria, who today are under attack by the Turkish military and by extension by the fascist transnational that has formed in our lives, in our presence. I speak of the Kurdish women movement specifically, with whom we realize a couple of projects together with Jonas Staal, and in particular New World Academy number 5, titled Stateless Democracy. Now, under attack and facing destruction are not only people, communities, and lands, but also one of the most powerful proposals, certainly of this current time, for non-fascist living, stateless democracy. And thus, when we hear today and in the next couple of days think the world otherwise, I would want to encourage us to keep in mind that fascism, to be sure, is no discursive struggle, but a bellicose turf war. And thus our collective work today, tomorrow, the day after, cannot stop at critiquing how things are, but must, with the same breath, imagine how things could be otherwise, and then go on to actualize and inhabit that imaginary, that proposition, and then live it as if it were possible. And this brings me to the last comment, no, number 5, which is very practical, changing gears and atmosphere, if you will. Please note, this event is photographed and filmed. I would like to thank all public and private funds for making this project possible. And I want to thank all of you in joining, not just in thinking, imagining, but also living that very alternative imaginary. Thank you so very much. And Sven, the floor is yours.
Thank you, thank you, Maria, for that brilliant introduction, and thanks for the invitation. I would also like to thank various BAC workers, in particular Irene, as well as Wietske, who cannot be here tonight, unfortunately. Thanks also to Janne, indeed, for hosting this and for putting me in this precarious position here. I tend to gesture quite broadly when I speak, but I think I have to watch myself here to make sure that balance is maintained. So yeah, just to follow up on Maria's introduction, a few notes basically in the form of questions or insufficient, sketchy answers to a number of questions. The first one being simply, which culture wars? This was actually a question I got from a couple of people. What exactly are you talking about when you say the culture wars? Well, the notion in itself emerged in the late 1980s, early 1990s in the United States. The term was canonized by James Davidson Hunter in 1999, and it referred to the Reagan-Bush era wars, if you will, about political correctness, as it got to be called by the right. So there was a strong strand of right-wing cultural activism that gained momentum throughout the Reagan decade. And in a 1989 column, Pat Buchanan called for, and I quote, a cultural revolution in the 90s that was to be as sweeping as the political revolution in the 80s. So the right-wing Reagan-style political revolution was supposed to be complemented and fulfilled, in a sense, by a cultural revolution. So it was about rolling back basically much of the progressive policies and changes in subjectivity and lifestyle that had emerged in the late 60s and 1970s. So it was a kind of conservative cultural revolution, essentially. And we can actually see that certain tropes really return in the present. So there is a clear genealogical lineage that we can trace from those Reagan-Bush era, mostly US-based, US-centric culture wars, to the current iteration. One such motif is that of cultural Marxism. So cultural Marxism is a trope that we encounter quite a bit today. It is a discourse, it is a certain rhetoric that is aimed at discrediting various forms of progressive politics. These are then framed as a sinister conspiracy, basically the conspiracy of cultural Marxism. There you have basically a fascist cartoon that shows you what kind of sinister alliance that is. In this case, it's a stereotypical Jew, and then somebody with Asian traits, as well as, I guess, sort of a Mexican, Latin American person and a black person, and they form this fist of cultural Marxism. What's kind of missing in this cartoon is the element of gender, which also plays an important role in this right-wing neo-fascist discourse, so the fact that white Christian American identity is supposedly under attack, not just from various ethnicities, but also from sort of gender warriors who threaten the sovereignty of the white male subject. And there's a couple of other images that sort of reflect the viral nature of this discourse on cultural Marxism. And it is important to remember that it did indeed emerge during these historical culture wars of the late 80s, early 1990s, and that it started out also as a blatantly anti-Semitic form of rhetoric, because in this narrative about cultural Marxism. The Frankfurt School is cast in the role of the bogeyman. So the Frankfurt School, basically, for some strange reason that is never mentioned, the Jewish proponents, the Jewish protagonists of the Frankfurt School left Europe and moved to the United States, and then they started to corrupt the young there. They infiltrated the educational system. They were active as teachers. They had an impact on the media, on public discourse, and they corrupted the minds of the young, leading them to embrace all kinds of progressive ideas and ideals that indeed led to this decline of certain traditional forms of identity and supremacy, we might say. Okay, so if Marxism in this narrative, if Marxism basically gets reduced to a Jewish conspiracy to destroy white Christian American superiority and supremacy, then what about this qualifier cultural? How does this narrative about cultural Marxism that plays such an important role in these culture wars, both historically in the late 80s and early 90s and today, how does this qualifier of cultural get to be defined? What is culture according to this discourse on cultural Marxism? The notion that is used here a lot of the time is, we might say, an odd combination of conservative essentialism on the one hand and a kind of cod Marxist superstructuralism on the other hand. So on the one hand, culture is seen as something that should be the organic outcome of a culture, of a people, of a society that has a certain ethnic homogeneity, right? So America should have a culture that reflects, that organically reflects white, Christian, and so on and so forth values, and it's the same for Europe, because of course this discourse has now been fully sort of incorporated into European far-right and neo-fascist discourse as well. So culture should be this kind of organic outgrowth of a certain homogeneous people and their values. On the other hand, the rhetoric on cultural Marxism also posits that a certain sinister elite infiltrated education, infiltrated the media, and corrupted the minds of the young. So here also we see that a certain notion of culture as having a superstructural nature is being used. So culture is on the one hand seen as this organic, essential entity that just reflects the values of the dominant population, or at least it should. On the other hand, culture is also seen as a domain within society, as a superstructure that is composed of institutions, that is composed of a certain discourse, that is actually managed, if you will, by specialists, by academics, by journalists, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, contemporary fascist discourse has it both ways when it comes to how culture is defined. We might even say that contemporary fascist discourse has it in more than two ways, because again, on the one hand, we have this organicist definition of culture as being essential, as being the organic outgrowth of a certain ethnically homogeneous group. But on the other hand, when it comes to the culture that is actually desired, this culture is also seen as being fundamentally individual in nature, because white, again, white, Christian, etc., culture is actually supposed to be the culture of people who are or should be strong, sovereign individuals, right? And this is a notion that we see constantly here, for instance, in the announcement of An Evening with Jordan B. Peterson, the meaning and reality of individual sovereignty. So one important characteristic, of course, of the discourse on cultural Marxism is that it is an attack on individual sovereignty, right? Free speech is under attack. We can no longer truly be ourselves. We need to be careful and on our guard, etc., etc. So our individual sovereignty is being curtailed. And this is a discourse that, for instance, if we look at Jordan Peterson's success, is actually staggeringly popular among, for instance, certain groups of white young men who seem to regard Jordan Peterson as their savior. But of course, he's far from alone in playing this kind of role. So yes, on the one hand, there's this collectivist organicist notion of culture, right? Right Christian capitalist culture based on individual freedom, individual sovereignty, and so on. And precisely because it is supposed to be based on this individual sovereignty, there is this sort of constant blend that they manage to create between a kind of collectivist, corporatist organicism on the one hand and a hyper-individual defense of individual sovereignty and the right to speak and the right to offend on the other hand, right? Somehow those two seeming opposites are then fused into a single notion of culture that is, however, obviously not without its tensions. But ultimately, this white culture that is Christian, that is based on Western values and what have you, is actually supposedly a culture that can only ever truly be understood and truly lived, truly practiced by true individuals, sovereign individuals who should never be forced to basically take anything into account that would limit their sovereignty and certainly not anybody's sort of rights and sensibilities and so on and so forth. So yes, contemporary far-right neo-fascist discourse that often sails under the flag of cultural Marxism, the defense of Christian, Western, white values against cultural Marxism. This kind of discourse has it in more than, not only in more ways than one, but in more ways than two or three even. What we of course also see is that then these supposed individuals, these sovereign individuals, actually often act like Pavlovian dogs, right? So actually there's a chain of triggering and being triggered, and this is sort of what we see all the time in the culture wars. So it becomes about actually becoming sovereign or becoming a supposed sovereign by actually following a playbook that is written by certain specialists, by the generals of the far-right neo-fascist culture wars. So you may think that you are a sovereign individual and you defend freedom and you defend your right to say whatever the hell it is that you feel, right? But ultimately you play in, let's say, the hands of Steve Bannon and his ilk. And of course, another important factor in this is that culture is no longer necessarily this traditional superstructure that is managed by a certain highly trained elite. Culture is indeed something that now pervades all of our lives. We might say that it always did, but now sort of everyday acts and everyday speech acts can also become public through social media in the blink of an eye. So what might have been a sort of private conversation beforehand is now public if we want it to be. So culture is no longer the exclusive purview of specialists, and if you're posting angry rants about immigrants or climate change, you are de facto a freelancer in the culture wars. And through the right though the right often upholds a lofty and elitist ideal of culture in theory, in practice, the far right has embraced a far more profane notion of culture as daily practice, as something that is lived and performed. But this performance then often takes the form of troll subjectivity and is marked by a certain aggressive hypersensitivity, by injured entitlement, and by confidence in the person's status as a sovereign subject. Now, of course, if, for instance, Jordan Peterson talks about individual sovereignty, there is ultimately also a kind of subtext here, right? Western modern notions of individual sovereignty are based on a certain notion of the individual subject as a holder of property and privilege. And historically, the notion of the self-reliant person has been indeed historically white, male, and wealthy, even though now to some extent it has been democratized. And it is even this very partial and incomplete democratization that is sort of seen as a threat and that triggers so many of these reactions. Right? So we have this historical subject that has its juridical basis, its juridical infrastructure as the legal subject that can own and sell property. And this is ultimately also, of course, what we see in all these angry defenses of the right to have the freedom of speech, the freedom to offend, right? It is the right to be actually this kind of self-reliant person that actually is built on a lot of historically accumulated privilege and on an imbalance of power. And Bini Adamczak, who is one of our speakers here later this week, Bini Adamczak contends that the capitalist property form, the capitalist value form, connects people by dividing them, right? So there is, of course, a certain connection that is established if I own something and you don't, or if I have the right to own something and you don't have that right. There is a connection that is established, but it is a connection based on separation, on division. And then a crucial question that Bini Adamczak asks is, what could play a comparable role to this property form under communism? What kind of Beziehungsweise, what kind of relational form not grounded on private property is possible? And how could we develop and strengthen such relational forms? Second question. Oh, okay, sorry, I have one more slide here to also just briefly illustrate indeed the role of certain networked agents in the contemporary culture wars, and in the fact that while on the one hand we have kind of keyboard warriors who are sort of the freelance sort of common soldiers of the culture wars, of course, there are still also generals, even though they may decide to lurk in the shadows. And one, I think, motif in this week that we're just starting up here will also be the question to what extent we can operate within certain forms of networked activity, within certain networked structures that are actually predicated on performing your own role as somebody who constantly needs to prove their worth as a worker, as an owner of property, but also as indeed somebody who constantly has to sell their labor power on the market. So within this kind of precarious economy, how to indeed gather and collaborate otherwise, how to assemble otherwise, we might say. Jonas Staal, who did the first training session this afternoon, has in his work often actually focused on the assembly form, taking cues from Judith Butler, for instance. And of course here too, with these training sessions in the wider context of Janne's project, we also have a certain focus on physical congregations in the same space, meeting up as people in the space or spaces of Buck. And I think this can indeed be a highly valuable and valid form of trying to become a different kind of collaborative structure, if you will, to pardon me, to not necessarily institute, but to organize otherwise. One question, certainly also during some of our panels, will be to what extent or how we can prevent from falling into sort of this treacherous dichotomy, right, of, on the one hand, the real space of physical gatherings, of assemblies, where we can truly be ourselves, where we can organize otherwise, where we can become other, and on the other hand, the sphere of actually pre-structured networks where we find ourselves in these sort of pre-given modes of presenting ourselves, of representing certain forms of subjectivity and intersubjectivity. How can we actually make sure that we see this as a dialectic and that we don't, let's say, hand those networks over to the Steve Bannons of this world, to put it very crudely and simply. And I'm sketching things here, of course, very crudely and very simply, just to outline some of those simple yet fiendishly complex questions. So the second question would be, yeah, why desertion? Why do you use that term of desertion? That sounds kind of defeatist. Why? And well, Maria already said some things about that. So indeed, I don't think that the notion of desertion needs to be seen in a defeatist light. It should indeed not be regarded as legitimizing a kind of escape into a kind of purely private or apolitical realm. Of course, the notion does have this link also with a whole history of the avant-garde use of military tropes, right? If we look at the European and American Western avant-gardes, but also possibly even beyond that, there is no shortage of tactical and strategic military tropes and imagery. And of course, the very notion of the avant-garde itself was imported from the military, right? The military vanguard. This then came to be applied to art and culture in the 19th century. And here's a couple of images that reflect Guy Debord's infatuation with military strategy and tactics. So Guy Debord, the leader of the Situationist International, the de facto leader of the Situationist International, for instance, created this board game, the Game of War. Military images of military campaigns are everywhere in his films, for instance, as you can see in the still from his final film. And he even collected toy soldiers, which is what you can see there in the top right-hand corner. So this kind of military fetish, we might say, of the avant-garde is something that, on the one hand, of course, I would also say is something that we should be critical of. On the other hand, of course, we also see, for instance, how this fascination for military matters then got to be translated in the 1980s and 1990s into the register of the distinction between the strategic and the tactical, right? Strategy versus tactics. This, for instance, was an important feature in so-called tactical media in the 1990s. And what we see in the 1970s already, indeed, is that there was this turn towards also notions such as desertion as well as flight. So there was this Deleuze as well as Foucault-inspired notion of desertion that came to feature both in activist and in artistic discourse in the second half of the 1970s and early 1980s. Foucault lectured on the changing status and meaning of desertion from the army at the Collège de France in 1978. And perhaps more influentially, Deleuze and Guattari wrote about the nomadic war machine in 1,000 Plateaus, in which they didn't so much use the notion of desertion, but they used the trope of flight. So a kind of instituent flight that Gerald Raunig more recently translated into the phrase desertion from the state apparatus. So there we see that with Raunig as this kind of autonomist writer and thinker, this notion of flight that we see in Deleuze and Guattari also gets translated into the register of desertion. For Deleuze and Guattari, a key influence in writing about flight was one of the so-called Soledad brothers, George Jackson, who had this quotation, this saying, "I may flee, I may flight, but while I'm fleeing, all the while I'm fleeing, I will be looking for a weapon." So this was also Deleuze and Guattari's background in sort of adopting this notion of flight, a flight that is not escapist, a kind of retreat, a flight that is indeed tactical, that is not sort of about admitting defeat, but that it is about it is about taking the flight to a different, taking the fight and the flight to a different plane of consistency, if you will. And this is also something that then came to feature in these partly Deleuze-inspired uses of the notion of desertion. So in 1977, for instance, the artist Jean-Jacques Lebel, who was close to Deleuze and close to Guattari in particular, wrote about, and Maria has already mentioned this, Lebel wrote about deserting but positively, déserter mais positivement. In recent years, indeed, notions such as desertion, but also fugitivity have again come to the fore. And talking about fugitivity, and Natasha Sadar-Hagigian will, I believe, return to this on one of our panels. Speaking about fugitivity, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have also argued that autonomism, that the tradition of autonomia, of autonomism, has a debt at a distance to the black radical tradition. They write that in autonomia, in the militancy of post-workerism, there is no outside. Refusal takes place inside and makes its break, its flight, its exodus from the inside. So there's this whole constellation here of interrelated notions that are indeed about a kind of imminent flight or kind of positive desertion. And this began to have an effect also, of course, in activism and theory, in practice, in theory as practice, in the later 1970s and 1980s, as people also kind of became disenchanted with certain Marxist, Maoist, and other Marxist models of revolutionary practice that had still been very prominent in the late 60s, around 1968. There was a certain sort of withdrawal, we might say, into what is often known as the Szene in Germany, or the milieu, right? So rather than trying to effect a classical Marxist-style revolution right here, right now, there was an increasing focus on actually work on and with subjectivity, intersubjectivity, new relations within a kind of milieu, building organizations, building autonomous counter-organizations. And in Germany, for instance, in this framework, a phrase by Lyotard, which actually only became famous in Germany because it was the title of this book, published by Merve Verlag, a phrase by Lyotard really had a huge resonance, das Patchwork der Minderheiten, the patchwork of minorities. So actually, indeed, a focus on working within a certain scene, working within a certain milieu with certain affinity groups, but beyond that, in certain networks. Then, of course, the question also becomes how to sort of link up those networks and how to make sure that these don't become, all too limited and limiting filter bubbles, let's say. If we sort of then fast forward to the present, we still see a huge, we still see the repercussions of these notions of this kind of thinking and acting and practicing from the 70s. So this focus on, let's say, imminent forms of flight, positive desertion. Jonas, this afternoon during our training session, also mentioned the Zone à défendre, for instance, in France, and various sort of French autonomous activities that are also very much about defending a certain territory and about becoming ungovernable, as you can see here. And of course, the Invisible Committee, which likewise uses the trope of desertion quite a bit in its writings, is also a huge factor in that. So yes, how to desert constructively, how to desert productively, for instance, by creating personae and organizations, by creating operational fictions and para-institutions, alternative organizational forms, connections and coalitions, in a situation marked by what has been termed the fascist transnational, right? The fascist transnational of the Bennons and Baudets and what have you. Could such a constellation, such a patchwork of organizations even become part of a new progressive international or transnational? So, questions generating more and more questions, basically. This brings me then to, okay, I keep forgetting my last slide. This is, in each section, there's a slide that I tend to skip, it seems. This is just a little photo, a moment from a gathering called the White West at La Colonie in Paris, the space founded by Kader Attia. The White West is one of these many conferences and symposia on the resurgence of fascism and on various contemporary fascisms. This is a panel in which we see Kader as well as Natasha Sada-Hagigian holding the microphone. She will also be here later this week. And actually at the far left, we see Jean-Jacques Lebel, whom I quoted a moment ago about deserting but positively. And Jean-Jacques Lebel and Kader Attia kind of have this intergenerational bromance. And here we see indeed also how certain forms of thinking and acting and organizing from the 60s, 70s, 80s connect quite directly to an amazing space such as La Colonie, which I would say we also have to see as part of a constellation within France. So on the one hand, we have, for instance, something like the Zone à défendre, and we have that kind of autonomism. And on the other hand, we have La Colonie as an incredible site of decolonial organizing and theory and socializing as well. And I'll return to this at the end briefly. But now my third and final question is, well, deserting indeed to which not yet, because of course we gather here also under the umbrella and in the mobile of Janne's project, which uses this fantastic term, right? Trainings for the not yet. and questions that Janne and Buck raise are questions such as how to be together otherwise, right? How to be together otherwise, also how to organize otherwise, how to, and I quote here, create a collectively shared basis from which the contours of another world and another future of the not yet can emerge, right? And there, at the end of this quotation, we have this notion of emergence. How can the not yet emerge from this contested present? And I'm reminded here of Raymond Williams's distinction between what he called residual, dominant, and emergent social forms. And I quote Raymond Williams, by emergent, I mean, Raymond Williams means, first, that new meanings and values, new practices, new relationships, and kinds of relationship are continually being created. But it's exceptionally difficult to distinguish between those which are really elements of some new phase, which are really only elements, new elements of some new phase of the dominant culture on the one hand, and those which are substantially alternative or oppositional to it. So those are emergent in the strict sense rather than merely novel. Williams also noted, and I quote again, there is always other social being and consciousness which is neglected and excluded, alternative perceptions of others in immediate relationships, new perceptions and practices of the material world, end of quotation. And well, some such perceptions, of course, have been bursting to the surface in recent years, and this has in turn strengthened a reactionary or neo-fascist backlash and the re-emergence of fascist tropes and forms. So if, for Raymond Williams, emergence crucially depends on finding new forms or adaptations of form, this is again quoting from Williams, emergence crucially depends on finding new forms or adaptations of form, then I would say that indeed we have to pay close attention to the forms that we use. And this is something we already briefly touched upon this afternoon, form, of course, can mean different things. It can refer to a visible, visual, or spatial form or constellation. It can refer to organizational form, which may not always be that apparent to outsiders. It can refer to, for instance, to the assembly form, right, the Occupy or post-Occupy style assembly form. It can refer to a terribly old-fashioned organizational form, such as that of the party or the union. And Jonas, for instance, has also organized something, or still organizing something called trans unions. You can there see a photo of one of the trans unions gatherings in Warsaw. And of course, here with Janne's practice of trainings for the not yet, we also have basically the constant challenge, the form as a constant challenge of gathering, of instituting otherwise, of organizing otherwise, and perhaps also then sometimes of coming apart, right? This afternoon during the training session, we had one group, one organization that was formed, but then it immediately dissolved again within the space of 2.5 hours, I think. But we'll return to that later. So with trans unions in that context, but not only in that context, Jonas, for instance, has also addressed the specter of the international, right? So there is, of course, also a certain localism, maybe a certain fetishization of the local that is part and parcel of our contemporary autonomist habitus. And to some extent, I would say we're all autonomists or post-autonomists now. We're not necessarily that comfortable with big bureaucratic organizations, with parties, and we're much more comfortable. And again, I'm sort of using a performative we here, but I have the feeling it's probably true for many of us. We tend to be more comfortable with kind of a more grassroots type of organization. But is that enough? And as Jonas Staal puts it, in relation to the specter of the international or the Comintern, the Communist International, I quote here, while the Comintern was brutally weaponized by Moscow, right, by Stalinism, the lack of a transnationality today shows its disastrous consequences. Authoritarian capitalist states pursuing aggressive foreign policies dominate transnational trade and military agreements and subsidize corporate actors that disproportionately influence our political and economic life. This leads to terrifying situations in which the Rojavans, who bravely fought and sacrificed to protect their multi-ethnic and multi-religious region against the Islamic State, are forced to ask support from the Trump regime. Well, this text is already dated because we know what happened, of course, as the Erdogan dictatorship threatens with their massacre, and I finish the quotation from Jonas's text with a quotation from Dila Dirik, as Kurdish women's movement activist and thinker Dila Dirik argued, that would be the moment to call upon a left air brigade. But in the post-Comintern world, in a world without a communist international, there is no such thing. So this is, I would say, a question that is looming in the background, and perhaps we often try to sort of relegate it to the background because it is too big and too daunting. So if we are lacking a Comintern or some kind of transnational or some kind of terrestrial, as I've proposed to call it, in the fight against the fascist transnational, and more broadly, the version of neoliberal capitalist globalization that is neo-fascism's raison d'etre, then what could such an anti-fascist and anti-capitalist international, transnational, terrestrial look like? Okay, I don't have much time left, so I will not go into great detail, but I would argue that one interesting, potentially very productive pointer, even though I also have some issues with that. One potentially interesting and productive pointer is Jodie Dean's proposal to revive another sort of horrible, dated, obsolete relic of the distant past, the notion of the comrade, the term comrade. So Dean claims that the term comrade points to a relation, right? Again, this notion of relation, of relationality, which is also central to Bini Adamjak. Dean claims that the term comrade points to a relation and a set of expectations for action. It doesn't name an identity, right? The problem of an identitarianism that kind of locks you into that identity. It doesn't name an identity. It highlights the sameness of those who share a politics, a common horizon of political action. I would say that Dean's insistence on working towards the comrade is valid and valuable, particularly indeed her insistence that comrade names a relation characterized by sameness, equality, and solidarity. But I would also argue that the notion of the comrade and, in a sense, the entire heritage of 19th and early 20th century communism has also been provincialized in recent decades, and actually it needs to acknowledge its own provincialization. We cannot simply claim that it is possible to resuscitate the universalist claims that it was able to make in the early 20th century. We have also very different notions coming, for instance, out of a more Latourian corner. Eduardo Viveiros da Castro and Deborah Danowski are also crucial here with their notion that actually what is happening today is a fight between humans, between basically essentially Western, liberal, privileged humans, the profiteers of capitalism on the one hand, and what they call the earthbound or the Terrans on the other hand. And then if, of course, for Dean and for many others, the prototypical comrade is still styled somewhat along the lines of the Bolshevist subject of the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. For people like Viveiros de Castro, the prototypical Terran is the indigenous. They are the indigenous. And so we have different figures, in a sense, different imaginaries, different ways of imagining contemporary figures of solidarity within certain groups and networks, within certain milieus, but also across their borders, different ways of indeed becoming allied in forms that do not actually take shape in a commodified register where we are always pitted against the other as competitors. So we have these terms, we have these tropes, we have these figures of the comrade, of the Terran, the Bolshevist comrade, the indigenous Terran. We have potentially, I would say, a patchwork of forms, a network of groups a montage of minorities that may become the basis for something that will not be a carbon copy, a mirror image of any previously actually existing international. However, I would say that in 2019, as in 1968, or in 1917, or in 1871, what is required is clearly long and patient work with and on the human wreckage that is us, right? So clearly we cannot will ourselves into becoming the perfect comrade or the perfect post-capitalist, post-white supremacist ideal subject, right? So we have to work actually with what we are, and we have to work towards becoming otherwise, right? And co-becoming otherwise. But this is long, hard, patient labor that will often be a matter of taking 2 steps backward, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or indeed the reverse, 1 step forward and 2 steps back. We are the all-too-human mutants and monsters of actually existing capitalism. Well, maybe not all of you, but I would certainly include myself in this multitude of the actually existing human mutants and monsters of neoliberal capitalism. Becoming comrade, becoming otherwise, instituting otherwise, organizing otherwise is a process whose success is never assured. And it is indeed also, I would say, a matter of montage, of patchwork, and of patching things up. One final image just to return us also to La Colonie, to Paris, where I was this spring. On the left there is a session of a decolonial school taking place at La Colonie with Norman Ajari and others. And then while this was going on, or just after that finished, actually there was noise coming from outside, and there was kind of a protest march of Gilets jaunes walking, marching, parading right past La Colonie, which kind of took everybody by surprise. So there we had this kind of montage, this clash perhaps, but also a potential alliance taking place within the urban fabric of Paris, different forms of organizing, of subjectivity and intersubjectivity, of working towards a not yet that came together. Well, they didn't quite come together, but at least they rubbed shoulders with each other for a moment or two. And I think a key task, quite obviously, is to take it from there. And that's where the long march, the long and patient and frequently frustrating work starts. Okay, these were insufficient, incomplete, maddeningly sketchy answers to some very basic questions, maddeningly sketchy answers that frequently took the form of more questions. I do not want to position myself here as the one in the know, right? I would rather see my own role in this week as that maybe approaching the Rancierian ignorant schoolmaster, because this week, this assembly, this program, deserting from the culture wars is very much on the basis of, this has been organized very much on the basis of questions to which I do not have the answer yet, but they're questions that I hope we will be able to flesh out a little bit more and that we'll be able to work on today and over the coming days. So, yeah, thank you very much. Let's see, do we have any time for questions now before we proceed with Jonas and the report from the training session? I can't really see much from here.
Are there any urgent questions now?
We can also save them. Yeah, you can also save them for the end. Yeah.
Oh, there are, okay.
It's less a question than an urgency, and that I really appreciate that all of the solidarity and love and hope that's being extended towards Rojava right now. But I also think that we cannot ignore Bolivia and Evo Morales, and I think we're all in agreement there that one cannot forget our brothers and sisters in Bolivia and what they are fighting for and against.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think indeed everybody is in agreement. And of course, right, one question that we will also be looking into this week, particularly I think in the session, the training session organized by Terra Critica, is actually also how to deal with this phenomenon, right? That even though I'm sure there's many sort of forms of dissensus also here within this gathering, and I'm sure we would find many disagreements if we looked for them, but for instance, on a question such as this, we are in agreement, right? And Terra Critica, for instance, also is really struggling with that issue. When they convene a gathering, they of course invite people within their network. How could one actually also counteract certain selection mechanisms to create gatherings that are perhaps more heterogeneous, right? But then if you rev up the heterogeneity to a point where basically it just becomes a reenactment of the culture wars with people exchanging entrenched positions, well, then that's clearly not productive either. But how can one sort of sail in between this Scylla and Charybdis of sort of excessive homogeneity on the other hand, and precisely the kind of staged heterogeneity with its ritualistic exchanges between entrenched and scripted political positions on the other hand. So I'm also very much looking forward to Terra Critica's sort of approach to that conundrum. I do, also encourage you to study the program and to see whether you can attend quite a few of our sessions, both the training sessions, although most of them are fully booked by now, as well as the public program in the evening with amazing speakers such as Bini Adamjak, Tom Hollert, who is already here, some extremely interesting panels, I should say, on Saturday and Sunday. So yes, I know that some of you are de facto almost hostage here as Buck Fellows, but you could still escape probably, and I hope you don't, and I hope you will participate as much as possible.
Hi, thank you. When you were talking about the notion of flight, via the Soledad brothers, you related it to Foucault, 78, and 1,000 Plateaus in a bit later than that. Surely the notion of flight goes to way earlier than the 70s,
sure.
Right?
Sure. What are you thinking of anything in particular? I mean, yes, of course, but are you thinking of anything in particular?
Well, via the Soledad brothers, I would say yes. We have a whole notions of marronage.
Right, exactly. This is what I hinted at very briefly by invoking Moten and Harney, right? They also argue that actually there is perhaps a kind of displacement, we might almost say, in certain forms of autonomist rhetoric. They call it a depth at a distance, right? A depth that is forgotten. Depth at a distance is forgotten. So they argue that the kind of autonomist discourse that uses notions such as flight and desertion doesn't always acknowledge those kinds of history. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think we will also return to that probably later later this week in some of the discussions in particular.
Nearly there.
Thanks a lot, Sven. I'm wondering, we're hearing a lot from you around forms and figures, but looking at this image, which is just a spectacular image, I'm wondering how you're thinking about let's just say the spatial relations of this planetary terrestrial
right.
affinity.
Mm-hmm.
How do we describe that? How do we...
Spatial relations, you mean sort of in a geopolitical sense, or?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right, so if we think about the figure of the comrade, then of course we're thinking about solidarity, but
Yeah.
how does one act in solidarity with global crises?
Yeah.
And so how even in this image, how do you think about the spatial
Right.
relation between
Yeah.
these two
Yeah.
figures or forms?
Well, yeah, very good point or question, and there's a lot to unpack there. Of course, what we also have to remember, and we already briefly discussed this earlier today in a sense with Janne before we even got started, talking about Jonas' work in Rotterdam. What we also see at La Colonie, of course, is that in a sense, right, global conflicts and certainly a history of colonialism, a history of French colonialism plays out, right, very locally, right? So that of course is sort of at the very basis of La Colonie. But then what we also see, of course, is, and I remember also having discussions about this with Kader Attia when the whole Gilets jaunes movement first started up. Some people were really spooked by it and really thought, well, what is this? Is this actually something like the Tea Party in the United States? Is this sort of is this another movement of white resentment, actually? And then in the next step, actually, there were attempts to forge alliances and to also engage with the sort of progressive potential in the Gilets jaunes movement. But this was certainly not sort of obvious from the start that this would even be possible. But then, you know, this was also a process that was started up, including, for instance, at La Colonie. They really did try to forge alliances and make sure that it actually is not another matter of divide and conquer, right? Of different sort of protest movements, different forms of contestation that are ultimately pitted against each other. Yeah, so when it's about form, also in a spatial and in a geopolitical sense, I think it's really important to argue also very strongly for, you know, basically the West's export, right, of violence, right? This is, of course, also a classical trope of leftist critique from the 60s, and not only from the 60s. The export of violence to the colonies, to the global South, of course, is a process that is now also sort of ricocheting back towards the former and current colonial centers, right? So in a sense, the problems have come home to roost. This is precisely what then also gets translated into neo-fascist politics. But this is precisely the point where we need to be able to articulate a different kind of agenda, right? We need to open a different kind of perspective. What does it mean, actually, that these problems can no longer be sort of shoved away and they can no longer be put at a safe, right, at a safe remove? What does it mean that these problems are actually also here today and they're here to stay? And this is, I think, where indeed new forms have to be sort of, let's say, invented, or old forms need to be revived. Sort of formal mutations need to be created. Also, when it comes to narrative, right? What kind of narrative is there actually about society, right? Right now, the narrative is clear, and it can also be visualized. We have these threatening arrows coming through the West, right? Caravans of migrants, streams of migrants, arrows pointing towards Europe, towards the United States. Well, that's a very strong, powerful narrative, and it can even be reduced indeed to a graphical figure of an arrow. So what other narratives are there, actually? And I think also there's a real impoverishment here, right? An impoverishment also, you know, and I would include myself in the problem here. There's an impoverishment among sort of, progressive forces. This is where a lot of work needs to be done, not just organizationally, not just in terms of how to articulate sort of progressive and emancipatory projects visually, right, in terms of visual form, but also in terms of sort of narrative structure. What kinds of promising or attractive, what kinds of attractive emancipatory promises exist out there right now, right? I mean, there was an older, sort of very limited, very exclusionary emancipatory promise, right? That was the sausage that was dangled in front of basically white Westerners in the 1950s and 1960s, right? If you work hard, then you will be able to, your children will be able to get a college degree and your children will have it better than you, right? I mean, clearly that's no longer working, even for a fairly limited segment of the traditional sort of white population in Europe and in the United States, right? So that emancipatory, that sort of compromised and corrupted emancipatory promise that was always based on exclusion, that's no longer working. So then we have this alternative fascist promise, right? If we just reinstate certain historical exclusions, well, we will be able to maybe defend certain privileges that are eroding. So what is the alternative, right? I mean, that's genuinely a question that I keep sort of mulling over, and I don't have the answer right now. But, you know, perhaps some of you do have the answer, and then I would really hope that you share it with us, or I would hope that we can actually get a little bit closer to seeing certain potential pathways during these days without being sort of naive about it. I think this is ultimately the crux, right? In formal terms, in structural terms, it is all very much about temporality. It is about temporality, about how you structure time, how people can think about their biographies, their lives, the lives of their children, how they can think in terms also of collectivities and the future, the futurity of collectivities, right? So we've returned, large sections of society have returned to the collectivity of the race, right? Of a certain white ethnicity. So yeah, what is the alternative? What is the emancipatory alternative? I think that is the real conundrum, as far as I can see, right? At least I think I can see this conundrum. Maybe some of you have already moved further in identifying potential ways beyond merely identifying it. Yeah. Do we still have more time for one or two more, or are we really running out of time?
Hi, I just have a very basic question, thinking about the idea of deserting as a tactic. And the question is like in defining what is the fight itself, because for me, or what I've heard a lot is that the fight is about existing in these, especially when it comes to media and technology. So sometimes some people see the fight is about existing on those platforms or these media. So is it still valid to think about fleeing or deserting in this sense? Isn't it in itself admitting defeat or letting the other, or like supporting the other side to actually have the space?
Well, I think it's also, of course, partly, I mean, it's a good question. And again, I don't have the answer, but I would say it's also partly a matter of critical mass, right? I mean, from what sort of point onward does something become more than sort of an individual or very marginal flight or desertion? That, I would say, is one issue, critical mass. Of course, and some people here are far more knowledgeable about this than I am. Of course, there is also a lot of work that is being done on sort of creating platforms, creating forms of communication that are not owned by Mark Zuckerberg, right? So if we, on the one hand, yes, do we want to hand over certain dominant platforms fully to, let's say, the right-wing demagogues and the fascists? No, we probably shouldn't do that. On the other hand, if we take it as a given that this is the zone of engagement, right, that this is the battleground, then I would say we risk becoming hostage precisely to playing into the hand of, right, the enemy. So on the one hand, not handing it over completely. On the other hand, not taking it as a given that this is what we have, right, that this is simply what the 21st century is going to be like. That would also, in a sense, I think, underestimate the fragility, ultimately, of certain platforms, right? That may seem all-powerful one moment, that may seem all-powerful one moment, but that may actually also start to crumble the next. Again, I think this is one of the questions we need to ask, and yeah, I'm not going to pretend here that I have the answer, but I think this is a question we should keep in mind over the next couple of days. So if we sort of define, or if we defend a notion of positive desertion, how can we make sure that this does not actually result in a withdrawal and basically handing over the dominant sort of zone of engagement in which the war over hearts and minds is being fought to the opposing forces? I think this will also definitely be a major factor in in Sunday's discussion. Yes, I think maybe we should, because otherwise it will get rather late. Yeah, Jonas.
It really seems too short. It looks very good on you, Sven, Comrade Sven, and Comrade Maria and Comrade Jan. Thank you for putting all of this together, and it was amazing to listen to this fantastic talk and through the questions and responses from all of you here, I felt that there was already a kind of big a starting articulation of this broader deserting alliance. I never understood desertion in terms of withdrawal. I understood it as rejecting enforced dichotomies that are not ours, definitions of us versus them as we've come to know them in the war on terror, ideas of white Christian economic nationalism versus so-called Islamic terrorism or Islamic fundamentalism. These dichotomies, or even the Brexit dichotomy between leave and remain, these dichotomies are not ours. So let them fight their own battles. Let us articulate what is truly ours. The reference to Bolivia is, I think, an extremely important one. The fight of Evo Morales, what he called an indigenous socialism that he brought into practice through his movement for socialism, his party, is one of the most lasting examples of new articulation of emancipatory coalitions between indigenous and non-indigenous through a contemporary socialism, for 21st century socialism, brought into practice through actual governance, not only as a form of opposition, of protest, but the fact that this coup against him is a crime and we should all speak out against it. And if we're talking about new alliances being formed now, from the massive movements in Beirut, cross-factional for the first time since a long time, the protesters in Chile that have been able to force the government to accept the rewriting of the constitution, the Pinochet constitution, the constitution of the fucking dictatorship, until the students that are now roaming the streets in Greece to fight against the new austerity, fascist austerity regime of the so-called New Democracy government. I think there's a lot of concrete practices in past and present based on which we can work on your proposition this week. Anyway, sorry, this was actually not what I'm supposed to be talking about here. I was supposed to talk about the organizational art training that we had today. I'll do it very quickly. That we had today with with 25 participants. Organizational art describes a practice of artists who work in the form of organizations, such as the laboratory, in the case of the Laboratory for Insurrectionary Imagination, that works through the autonomous Zone à Défendre in Notre-Dame-des-Landes in France. It can be the Silent University, founded by Ahmed Ogoud, an organizational artwork in the form of a university that tries to unsilence the knowledge of migrant and refugee academics. It can be the organizational artwork in the form of the political campaign, like Tania Bruguera's Immigrant Movement International, that propagates the migrant as the new global citizen based on which the interstate order should be fundamentally revised. Or it can be an artist organization like the Natural History Museum by Not an Alternative, a coalition, a collective of indigenous activists, artists and academics that are trying to create an alternative museum that shows the consequence of extractivist politics and the climate catastrophe on our very understanding of nature. No longer nature as a neutral backdrop, but nature as an actor, as an active subjectivity. And turning in the process the Natural History Museum into a new site of alliances between indigenous peoples, climate scientists and artists. So what we tried to do today in a really short period of time was to develop a series of 5 artist organizations of our own by working through notions such as narrative, articulating common narrative through common cause, through infrastructure, articulating alternative infrastructures or hijacking or repurposing of existing ones, working through morphological issues, so building a kind of visual vocabulary through which artist organizations could operate, and modes of presentation and representation. Here we see an example of the Time Travelers Alliance, a new artist organization founded today with a fantastic, ever-changing visual symbol that suggests an idea of infinity, but it's a kind of pluralistic infinity. It's an infinity of the many, of all the members of the organizations that perform this same gesture. The Time Travelers Alliance is obviously an alliance of alternative time-traveling organizations and resists or opposes the extraction of time and the inequalities of lived time in our present. There is an artist organization that was founded and disbanded on the same day, the Drop In for Common Insecurity, an organization that fights for the fundamental redistribution of care, both in terms of care in relationship to labor practice, but also mental care. There's a fantastic artist organization founded today that I do not have an image of, but that is called the Word to Mouth Media, which would be an alternative media platform that completely bypasses technological infrastructures, but in which the bodies of the narrators, of the journalists, are themselves also their own infrastructure. So it would be a fundamental overhaul of the existing media monopolies through a kind of performative media, storytelling-based media. There was the Conspiracy of Unequals, an artist organization founded today that resists the conditions of managerial evaluation, the constant surveillance of knowledges in universities and in working environments. And finally, there's an organization that had no name, only this sign, an organization that resists organizational capture as such, an organization that will be there the moment that we need it, but that opposes or at least rejects identification through singular logos or narratives or 10-point party programs. If I did not summarize these conceptualizations of these alternative artist organizations correctly, I really apologize. These were some of the key ideas or pointers that I picked up on in the different presentations. It was quite an intense but very beautiful experience insofar that these, only in a short period of time, through this notion of organizational art, we can start to draw these alternative infrastructural maps. For me, every single one of these organizations, it tends to be more interesting than the ones that are dominating our political and social discourse today. And that in itself shows that through artistic organizational art practice, we can create horizons of desire, not of the organizations as we know them, but as they could or should be. I want to end this short report on something else. Tonight, there were already a few references by Maria, by Sven, when it came to the comes to the revolution of Rojava and the current Turkish occupation of the autonomous area in northern Syria, governed by an alliance of Kurds, Arabs, and Assyrians since 2012, where they have brought into being an alternative political model called stateless democracy, based on local self-governance, gender equality, communal economy. As Maria said it very powerfully, it has been a horizon for many of us, and many of the Rojavans that have worked also here together with Bak. They are our comrades and our friends. They have showed the possibility of creating new forms of life. There's a famous slogan in Kurdish, Bergwadan Giani, resistance is life. But through resistance, they have also created new models, new possibilities of living. Because of the Turkish invasion that is doing everything to massacre the heritage of the Rojava Revolution, for which 11,000 revolutionaries gave their lives. Because of this current occupation, the yearly Kobani Film Festival cannot take place. The Kobani Film Festival was initiated by the Rojava Film Commune, a collective of revolutionary artists and filmmakers that educated the new generation of filmmakers, that translated historical cinematic landmarks in Kurdish, and who produced their own new feature films. They used this model of stateless democracy, this revolutionary model, as a form of collective practice, and they were the ones who initiated this yearly film festival in order to popularize not only a new revolutionary political model, but a new revolutionary culture. Now, our friends in Rojava have asked us and many other cultural institutions and universities today to screen one of the films that would otherwise have been screened today in the Kobani Film Festival. So not only here tonight at Bak, but in many places in the Netherlands and across the world, we are continuing, or at least putting into practice, the work and the heritage, cultural heritage of the Rojava Revolution. This might be a modest contribution, but considering the fact that there was no real military threat posed by the Rojavans towards the Erdogan regime, the second largest NATO army, and he nonetheless found it necessary to invade with all his might to murder and slaughter and destroy the infrastructures built painstakingly by those who fought the Islamic State and fought to create a new alternative democratic model, that shows that the threat was not a military threat, it's a threat of ideas. It's a threat that it is still possible to live differently, to live otherwise, to practice a different kind of politics, a different kind of commonality. That shows, however tragic and painful the current situation is, that shows the value of ideas and the value of the work, not only of the political revolutionaries, but also the cultural revolutionaries, the artists. So we're going to watch the first chapter of Stories of Destroyed Cities. The first chapter is called Shengal. It's 50 minutes long, directed by Sero Hinde from 2016, produced by the Hlavajova Film Commune.
أري من دقوقي تشتاق بتابي لفئ دنياي تجاري نامين فاي أساس صاخم أزي نمريمة بشتي تشوي رونيا وان شاوي تي كتشك دشاوي من دمانه أكيدي شنغالي قام قطو تأخوا سبارت آخي وك دورك اكشخارا بيشي أس دلبرا تا أزي بوري خوا كوركم وچه بدسته تنهات أزي ويبكم تلوي داري هر آزاد بي أو جيه كتهيلاي أزي تمام بكم أز إيدي جريلاي إزيديان طول هلدانم سوز ددم وسوز ددم
بله کرم که از مرادم بیجا بله از مرادم تدنگه مش بیر کریه معنا خراب آره والله الحمد لله شقديت ساق بير رحمن مريتا هلا راستا خدي اجي تشوف ما قامش لو ما نوم فاتقرنا هيج بري بين استما شنقال أريب خدي مقو از بيجمتا او امانات هنجي امانات تقو بهاري وی بویا هاوینجی خودی هم محتاج بینا تاگو تجمرت جواب ده تاگو بهاری اره تمام باش سر جوابه
أهلا سر جوا كرم بك خلا
سلامي والريحان مازن بيا بخير خاطر مرات شبك
أي بلي أزبني كرم بك
قالك ممنون اسمع قدر بابتها
أهلا سر جوا صحة نعيمة
سمرة غير أنا محضر غير محل
يلا بقرب قراطيب الشنطة يا راجل بس تمشي
بس
والله العظيم عجل شو ما بدي ابيع
علشان في تعال
شوفي ايش بدك شوفي
بس كيرمي بي
قالك يا صدى ورقة قصاية عزاء
شندية
أبحق 7,000 دينار عراقي
كرامك
صعبة قالك سباس ممنون
مروي يبقى على كده
بلا صد شعبة أهلا وسهلا صد شعبة أهلا وسهلا
كوني
صد شعبة أهلا برا صد شعبة
قاعدة جنا هنا
زحفتها
كجا كي قيس بجيب دم
أهلا وسهلا قاعدة أبا كربكة
شندية
14,000 دينار عراقي
كاد مربك على قبل زحمة
أهلا وسهلا صد شعبة كرمكة
اشتري حتى قالك
صد
ممنون
شعبة أهلا وسهلا
بله زعراتنا درسا چوی مگو لوی داره گلن نتاو به هفره دجی جبرکو افدر باجارکی گفنارا بدن بر زعراتنا هیاکو از نبیشن درس خلاص نابا باشا؟ باشا دادم باش هدا زعراتنا هدا هدي
دربو دزور لو أسهاتم براساتم دزور وقت باب المورا هاتم ديسا قاسم راد يمي ده باشا سباز درمانوي بدني ده باشا
فواد بيشترى شلون باشا اقلاو هينا اقلاو تدونا زين بس ذكر واش بان في رقم اقلاو چنده
1500 دينار
درم
برا قمد دزوبا بابي ما تشتري خوش المرة عنينا برا تمام بس بين دقيقة
فواد بيشترى شلوني وزير هينا شارج مربك على قبل هينا ليف كيلو دي دنجي چند حقیقان؟
5000 دینار برم.
5000 برم.
سرچاوا
چوانی واشی
چوانی
اندر سال چوانی
خیلی هاتنی
خیلی تبی سرچاوا اندر سال
تلفي أبونا أنا مبارك كده
اره والی
كما وقتي خلاص
مرحبا برات
سرچاوا
شواي
سرچاوا چوانی
باشن صاحبي ما بيس القامشلو
اره واره چوبون قامشی
قامشلو شابو
خودی باش بو وقت هر جاری دی مگر گلک سراج بو آنین
يسر شابا دخير دقاكي أبونا مراد هاتي بيجاتي
بس خوش أمرات بخير هاتي
تبی سرچاوا
تشاواني باشي
ماشي
صحتاتا ما قولي بتشوى قامشلو قامشلو شاوابو خلقي قامشلو
اره ولا چوبون قامشلو هناك تشت مكرين للرياح خدا شو ما مالا وجهي مكتوبة كشتر شان بون
صحتاتا خوش
برمك
مالا تاغا عمري تدريش با يكرمك خوارنكي چايكي
اجي كيش ما مالي اساخري ما مهي زاروك جي نديتينو ولا
دي مالا تاغا صحتاتا خوش كتشوي سلاغا جيبكا
عليكم السلام
سر
صاحبي
چاوابي
رحمة
خير
الله عليكم
وسلام
اوه اسهاتم ون لكي درينا محلو دربو عدول كتامن وبيريا بابي خو نقربو وناين بابي خو
بابا ما تخاص بيريا تقربو بابا دشتش مرانينا حيبا قمد ذكر خو تحيبناكي بخير هاتي بابا
كلام دادي كان ورم تشتج وراني هنا ورمن اف ادايا اف جي جترا او جي جكاچا من ريا كاداكا وا قلنا دي ساج من قهاريا بس ايه
كراتي مراد اساخري مش بركه خوارن سربو مسرع
او خوارن حاضر جي ناخذ نها بلا داكا وجي بي بلا خو حاجز نكا كاوي تلفزيوني في خجاري بنت شو اخبار هلو
ايه بخير هاتي خوارنا بيتا تجي حست كي مشتارة شكريا بس بلكي تبخارنا مراجينا بيتا حلمي عقام مش لو تتقل
تنقاري الا تشتكي بيجي بسي تزاني من شقاسي بيريا خوارنا تكربو لدي ساجي
دي ساجي چه دي سا چه
هاورت وتنا کرسي چا خوشا
And so we must end on this very sobering and haunting note. But thank you, Jonas, for this, for this montage of our exercises in organization building and imagining forms of organizational art this afternoon, and then this stark reminder of the very real consequences also of the culture wars, the very real effects and deadly effects of symbolic skirmishes on the ground. We'll leave it hanging for there, but I would just like to briefly remind you of tomorrow's program. In the afternoon, there's a training session by the collective Rosehammer, which includes artist Dora Garcia and Per Oscarloy and others from Oslo. There will then later, also in the evening during the public program, be a kind of representation or a theatrical presentation on the basis of that training. So I think maybe tomorrow the presentation of the training session in the public evening program will take a somewhat more performative and theatrical direction than today. And tomorrow night we will also, and I'm really looking forward to this, have a lecture by Tom Hollert, Transfixing Fascist Episteme. And yeah, if you can make it, I do really recommend you that lecture, and then also the ensuing discussion, which hopefully will take us one step further or two steps further and then one step backward. So thank you very much, and I hope to see many of you tomorrow. Did I forget anything, Maria? No? Okay. See you tomorrow. You're free to go. Thank you.